Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the last one on the last day. You made it, or for those of you who had fun last night, the first one on the last day. My name is Paul Schaeflein, and I'm going to talk about how to App-etize your SharePoint solutions. Now, I have to say that Waldeck and I were sitting in, of all places, a hotel bar at the MVP Summit last year when we heard about this, and he said it, and I stole it. So thank you. But now it's trademarked by me. He can't use it. I'll sue him because I'm an American. That's what we do. We sue the life out of people. But thank you. So what does that mean, really? So I want to basically talk about what you've got a bunch of SharePoint 2010 code out there. What are you going to do with it? So we'll talk about some of those things this afternoon. Before I go on, I want to remind you there is a Ask the Experts session immediately following right next door, and basically Steve Smith, our organizer, wants to have a picture of all the speakers in one room, everyone together. So since we're all there, he's going to let you ask us some questions. So it's a chance for you to catch up on anything that you haven't had a chance to this week. Obviously a lot of overlap on sessions. You may have missed something. It's a chance to at least try to get a question out there. But it's a very full room and lots of people, so your questions really need to be good, right? It scares a lot of people, right? So just be forewarned. All right, having said that, let's move on to about me, right? So my name is Paul Schaeflein. I'm an independent contractor doing SharePoint for quite some time. I have contact information up on the screen. I have cards because the last name is quite difficult to spell, so if you want to reach out to me later afterwards, you're welcome to do so. I'm going to call out the last part here, which is part of the developer track last year. So how many were here last year? And how many sat in this room for 3 long days last year? Yeah, actually, I got to sneak out at the end, but yeah, so what I wanted to do, my approach this time was, hey, we did all this SharePoint 2010 development, and if you remember last year, we had a solution that we did in the sandbox, and we tweaked it some things to do a farm solution, and that's what I did at the beginning. And then after I was done, the real developers in SharePoint came along and extended it, and built Visual Studio templates, and built web templates, and extended BCS, and on, all the features that you can do in SharePoint. So it was rather complicated. This year, none of my buddies are here, except Waldeck. Right? Everybody else. But to be honest, you didn't write the solution, you wrote the Visual Studio extensions. So you really didn't do much of this talk anyways last year, did you?
Doesn't that make me your buddy?
That makes him my buddy. Hey, he's actually my favorite SharePoint developer, to be honest, because he writes tools that help us do our work better. So get them, especially the replaceable parameters. That's my favorite. I love that one. All right. So obviously, I'm not going to cover everything we did last year into 2013. I'm going to talk about the core stuff that I know. Okay? So let's get an agenda. All right. A lot has changed since last year, since the last product release, actually, right? And what I've noticed is I have a lot less hair. I have more gray hair in the beard. I can't see as well, as evidenced by this, right? I can't hear as well as I used to. Yeah, all right? And so as I was putting together my agenda here, I realized what I'm doing is I'm remembering the good times, man. It was so much better. Back when I was young and walked uphill to school both ways, and yeah, that's what it feels like, right? So we'll cover a little bit about what we did, and what I mean by that is we'll go into a little bit more detail about what we did last year, because I understand not all of you were here last year. So we'll talk about what we did in an overview of what we've done in 2010, right? And then we're going to complain and, okay. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what's new, right? What's come up in 2013, what things should be on your radar. Now, I fully realize a lot of what I will be showing you for new in 2013 is probably not new if you've been here all week. However, some people may look at things different order on the video or whatever, so I have all the slides in there and we'll go through those, right? And then, since I'm an independent consultant, and if I don't work, I don't get paid, I really can't just complain all day, so I have to do something. So then we'll go through and I'll show you what I've done, some approaches that I've done, a couple of demos of what I've done in 2013, taking this solution that we've had. All right? So that's what we plan to do. I hope that it's interesting to you, and we'll move on, right? Okay, so what we did last year. As I said, we had this application, and we had a great, well-thought-out requirements document that was created by committee, and it included all these things. And so I don't need to go through all of that, but because you can imagine it covers a typical spectrum of what a departmental level app needs to do inside of SharePoint. And then obviously maybe there's some enterprise-y things at the end. But remember, this is demo code, so just as Miriam showed you, it won't be enterprise code. All right, but this is what we had done last year. This is our knowledge base. And the idea was we want to have a knowledge base that stores its information in SharePoint and let people maintain that, but we're going to have a fancy user interface on top of that. We don't need to write CRUD forms because SharePoint lists have those built in for us automatically. And then so we had pretty looking pages, and then we extended it with search and so on like that, right? And then we went on and Eric Schupps put together this fancy slide, which I don't usually do, but if I hit the button, it adds things to it. So what we did is we created web parts for some pages. We just built in the leverage the existing list forms to do some of that. We added keyword searches using the search API. Right? We went on and used BCS to leverage a database of things that were related content. All right? Used people search, which was really a big hit. Matt McDermott did that. I know he did some sessions this year as well around that. And then lastly, we had some fun stuff with the offline content. We were generating documents using OpenXML and converting them using the web, whatever WAS is. Word Automation Services, thank you very much. All right, so that's what happened last year. Today, I'm going to focus more on this stuff because, again, because of time, number one. Number two, there were other sessions on these other things this week, and if you didn't see them, you'll get the video and you can watch them later and by someone who's more appropriate to serve those, all right? So that's our focus for today. Does that make sense? And I'm calling it the foundation because if you have last year's code, or if you are going to want to get last year's code, we put it on Codeplex. It's spkbase.codeplex.com. It has all the stuff from last year. And there is in the agenda on the home page, it says the foundation of our application, and that's what I started with. So what I'm showing you here is the solutions from the foundation session we did last year. And that's what we got there. Here's what it looks like. There was a bunch of data in a list somewhere named articles, and we didn't want to show it using the list view. We wanted something fancy, and so here's what it looked like last year. Now, let's move on to 2013. And here, what's the new thing, right? So we're going to complain about what's changed, right? So we have these apps for SharePoint in the store. Hey, this might be something that's good to put in the store, right? So that they're thinking, I can see how it was a typical departmental app. Maybe I want to put it in the store. So that could be interesting. What does that mean for me? So or I can put it in a catalog. So that means I have to use. Okay, I borrowed this from MSDN, and they said it's familiar programming model. How many people in here have been doing SharePoint for more than one version, right? Have you ever done OData? Have you ever done OAuth? Familiar? Yeah. Okay. As I said, we're going to complain about change, right? Development tools. Well, the one in the middle is a development tool. I'm real good friends with the guy who's working on Napa, so don't tell him neither Waldeck nor I said anything about that. Okay. They've enhanced the platform. Well, this slide is true, right? Well, I mean, they're all true, but this slide I can kind of get my head around. They've done somewhere, right? So the REST endpoints are better, and that's okay. The extended APIs. Well, to be honest, they've extended the server API in every release because they dream up a new functionality and they implement that functionality, but then some other guy at Microsoft needs to use that, so they need the API themselves. So they've done that before on us, right? Now, client-side rendering is kind of a neat technique. I'm not going to talk about it. I've seen a demo of it. It looks pretty nice. It addresses some pain points. And remote event receivers can also be very helpful, being notified when things happening, and that's kind of an ongoing trend. So this one, I'm okay on this one. So of all the fun things they've done here, we're only looking at maybe a few tidbits for us, right? The rest of it is going to be a struggle and a learning curve, and so on. So what I'm going to do first here is now let's take our solution from last year, and what are we going to do with it this year? In 2013. First thing I did is I went into my 2013, I have a 2013, oops, I gave away the secret here. I'm going to go to my site collection. They moved this again on me. Go to site settings. First thing I did is I created a server running SharePoint 2013. I'm not an IT pro guy, so I did next, finish. I ran the wizard. I have a site. Life is good. I went into my solution gallery, and I uploaded the sandbox solution from last year's conference. And I uploaded it, and I clicked activate, and then I went to my home page, and I added a web part. Come on, I'll go to the home page. And it works. Okay, thank you for coming. We're done. Yeah. So sadly, there's a little blurb in MSDN that sandbox solutions are deprecated, and I'm sure you've heard that a lot this week, which basically means there's no additional investment being done to the sandbox. And thank goodness they're just executing it, right? It's done. It was a pain to begin with. There were a lot of things didn't work. We can go on and talk about that. Back in the commiserate about how the good old days, how much we used to struggle to learn that something new. That was it. So that's done, right? Now, in addition, there was a full trust solution that we did last year, and I could add that and deploy it, and guess what happens on that one? It just works, right? So the good news is stuff that you've done before is going to work for the most case. I didn't run into too many troubles. If I had tried to gone further in our application, as Miriam just described, I would have run into some trouble with the metadata stuff that she talked about. So there are some things that have changed, but for the most part, your code will work as it always has worked. So the familiar programming model for most of us is going to be the same old programming model. But what does that mean now for the unfamiliar programming model? All right, so I have two approaches here that we could do. Obviously, if you've gone through the app model, we have SharePoint hosted apps, and we have cloud hosted apps. So, in thinking back about the way our application was structured before, we had a bucket full of fields, site columns. We had a couple of content types. We had some web parts. We had lists, and our data was stored in a SharePoint list. So initially, my first thought was SharePoint hosted seems to be the way to go, because part of the benefit of what we did last year was we didn't have to write pages to add, delete, update data, right? So first thing I did was a SharePoint hosted app. So let me go to Visual Studio and show you what I did there. And this is our solution, appropriately named SP-Evo. You probably can't read that. So let me do this. All right. So, as you can see here, some things look new. So I don't know if anyone's going to talk about what's new in Visual Studio, but there are new SPIs, new SharePoint items. You can add an item to a project of type site column, and that's what KB article is. It actually is more than one column in my opinion, but that's what it is. And the KB article list is a new SPI, updated SPI, called a list. Add a list, it will let you create the schema as well as an instance of it. So you can see how I've appropriately named those two items there. I have a page, and then I have, oh, I'm sorry, I got this backwards. KB article is my content type. Site columns is down here. Sorry about that. And then I have my scripts folder, and that's the one that everyone's been complaining about all week, and we'll get to that in a minute. So this is our project that we're creating. Most importantly, I can create a custom app icon. Or in this case, I can use Steve's, right? So to me, that's the most important, right? There's a little chuckle, but don't underestimate the value of branding your solution, even if it's a departmental app, especially in the list of features that you create, right? How many features did we create last year? 8, 10, 12. Miriam had a dozen of them. If you have a dozen features on top of all the SharePoint stuff, which ones are yours, right? Little icon goes a long way. All right, so I'm going to show you real quick, starting at the base of things that you would put in your solution is the columns. And you can see here not much is different. It is a bunch of XML. If you were to add a new item to your project and choose site columns, SharePoint will give you a text field with a brand new GUID, and that's it. There's no designers, but at least they do new GUID for you once. So create GUID.exe is still going to be our most favorite development tool if you're doing SharePoint site columns. But Visual Studio has finally added it to the list of tools out of the box. Thank you, Mike Morton, yes. Okay, so nothing fancy on site columns. On top of the site column, we built content type. So here's the KB article as my content type, and I'm going to click on this, and it's going to think. And it's going to think, and we're going to pray that the network is working. At the bottom, it says communicating with SharePoint. So they've given us a content type designer. Yes. So what happens here, this is the contents, the columns that I've chosen. I'm going to click here and add a column and zoom in on this, and you can see we have a lot of things here listed. It's basically a large drop down. So what is happening is Visual Studio is looking in your project at all the site columns you've defined. In addition, it is connecting to the development site that you choose when you create a new project. Remember the wizard, new project, type in a URL. It's connecting to that site to get a list of all the site columns in that site. And it's presenting them all to you in a list, showing you the display name and the internal name. And so that's what I'm seeing in these two columns. If I scroll down, and you can see there's a lot of them. I always tell people, when I'm counseling developers, if you're creating columns and content types, the second most important thing you can do is add a group to them so that you can filter them in the UI by group. But we can't do that as developers in the tool. All right, so I have a content type here with a bunch of things. And I have another tab here for the content type itself. And you can see here I give it the name and so on like that. I didn't show you, when I add a new content type to the project is when I can pick if you want to inherit from the parent one, right? So it'll help you pick the parent content type ID for you that you need to put into the XML. If you want to see the XML of this, you can right click and choose view code. I'm sorry. You can open this and double click on the XML file itself. Some of them will show the view code, but in this one, right, so if I click on the elements.xml, I get the XML. If I click on the name, I get the designer. So this doesn't look much different than anything you've seen before. Ignore the text catch-all, they're not going to work, they're not supported. I just found that out an hour ago, so we're moving on. Yeah, you can't do metadata fields declaratively in 2013. It's not supported. Miriam just told us that. Did you guys know that? Figures. I'm an old man. I'm way behind the thing. Okay, so back to our solution. I have site columns. I have a content type. Next, I want a list, right? I want to store my data in a list. So I created a list. And if I double click on the list here, I am going to also get a designer. So in addition to a content type designer, I get a list designer. Looks a lot the same. The key difference here is down at the bottom, it lets me choose content types. So what I did is I deleted out of the box, and I said create a new content type. And the wizard says, do you want to have, I'm creating a new list. So it says, do you want to just have a list based on an existing template, or do you want to create a new one? I said create a new one. It gives me the wizard. I delete all the columns. I hit the content type button, and I added my content type into the list. And again, this is communicating with SharePoint to get the list of available content types and presenting them for me to choose. You with me on that? Someone over here remembers that I like auditory feedback, and I can't hear very well because I'm an old man. So if you have a question or something, be sure to make sure I hear you. When I click OK on the content type, it adds all my columns in there, because when you create a list, you have to specify fields like 17 times to make sure they work. I avoided list templates myself and list definitions. I mean, I've been doing SharePoint a long time. I never wrote a production list template or list definition because it was kind of complicated. So actually, I just got lucky. But now they have, with this new one, I can click the Views tab, and I can write all the views. I can just pick, I can create a new name for a view if I wish, and I can pick and choose what columns using a familiar add, remove, up, down button designer thing. This is fantastic, right? We love this. Create a view. Do your end users a favor. Do yourself a favor. Never change all items or all documents. Please create a new one. Set your new one as the default, because your end users are going to do something and break it. And then you can say, well, switch to all items and their data's back. And then they get that calm feeling that, oh, I didn't just delete all my data. All right? If you've been in that situation, you do understand what I'm saying. Lastly, we have a tab for the list. And this is where I can give it information that I'm going to care about right now, because this is the title and the URL and stuff like that. Remember, I still need to know the title for lists. When I finish my list designer, what I end up with is, I should show you this. I'm sorry I didn't begin with. If I'm going to do add new item, and what I chose here was a list. I chose a list. And when I choose a list, what ends up being built here, there's two choices here. I created a customizable list template or list instance. That's what I chose. You can just choose to create a list instance all by itself. Because I chose the customizable one, I have a list. The elements.xml and the schema.xml are my list template. And I can show you those real quick by clicking on the actual file. I have a list template, type number 10,000. Hey, that's my number. I like that. I have a list now I can identify by number instead of by name. End users can change the name, they can't change the number, right? In addition, I get the schema, which is as ugly as it always was, but I didn't have to code this by hand. And in addition, I get a list instance element to actually create my new list. I've hidden some things there, we'll get to that in a minute. All right, any questions now on the data bits? Yes, sir. I'm sorry?
What's the base content type that we create?
I created a content type that derives from item. Right? His question was, what is the base content type? So I created a content type just based off of item, title, and ID. I'm good to go. Okay, now, I think I'm in good shape. I have all my data foundation pieces ready to rock and roll. I'm going to go ahead and deploy this thing because I'm going to do my have my data stored in a SharePoint list. So, as you might recall, as we talked about before, in a SharePoint hosted application, where are all your SharePoint components deployed? To the app web. Does the app web have new edit, new form, display, new item, disp item, or edit item.aspx in it? I see a couple of this, which I'm hoping is a no instead of falling asleep. But so the answer is yes, they're there. The bad news is you can't get to them. So first roadblock that I come across, what do I do with my data? So I have a few choices here, right? I wrote demo code, so I didn't do any of them, but things that you could do. You could write code to create these items in the host web, if you'd like. Or you could create a sandbox solution that has no code, but just declarative and deploy it to the host web, which is kind of cheating. Or you can put your data somewhere else. Or you could write pages to do the update, your choice. That's an exercise for the student, if you will. I didn't do any of the above. I cheated, and in my list instance, I added 10 rows of data using the declarative rows. And here's why, right? And I think you may end up doing this at some point. So I was going through this over and over again, right? And I wanted to see, right? You do some iterative development. Well, I got tired of adding data to my table or my list every time I read. So let me go back. If I press F5, it deletes it and re-adds it, right? In Visual Studio 2010, it would detect that you're creating a list instance and it already exists. Do you want to delete it? Yes or no. You could do some things around that, right? And so in SharePoint 2013, this example, I don't have a SharePoint, I don't just have a list instance, I have a whole app web. And so when I press F5 to deploy again, it says, oh, well, I'm going to uninstall the existing app, which means the app web goes away. So everything in my app web went away. And I got tired of doing things. So I just cheated. I loaded my 2010 farm, ran it, grabbed the XML and dropped it in. So that's what I think you'll end up doing this. Obviously not production ready code, but it's simple enough to delete this before I create my production solution. All right. So I'm going to switch over to, okay, so hold on. So let me go back here. The next thing we did, I talked about our data. And what we ended up doing in our requirements document and what we did in the app last year was we said we wanted to have a pretty display of data for when you first enter the application, if you will. We would show you a grid that has like the most recent articles with a way to filter that across the top. And then in a typical web paradigm, in the grid, column 1 of the grid was a link. You click on the link and it would take you to a detail page. Okay, so now I'm in a SharePoint hosted app. They give me a pages, they give me a default.aspx, but remember I can't do server-side code in a SharePoint hosted app. It's not allowed. So, following along in that model, I said, okay, I can play nice, I can do that. In my pages folder, I just extended default.aspx. And it's communicating with SharePoint, so I'm losing some stuff here. If I can scroll down. I tried to avoid that. I think we'll be patient. Being an old man, breaks are okay with me. So, I have to write HTML and JavaScript if I'm going to do this, right? So, I'm in a somewhat fortunate position because back home, I have a pretty good relationship with the developer and platform evangelism group at Microsoft who live in town with me. And I've taught them how to do SharePoint, so they like me. And then I said, so if I have to just write a web page using HTML and JavaScript, what's the thing to use, right? And he said, knockout. And I said, yeah, I'm knocked out of the sandbox. What do I do, right? No, knockout's what you want to do. So I pull out Bing and off I go. Hey, you know what? Knockout has data binding. Yes! I know data binding, right? I do .NET like crazy. So I have a table that I'm putting here, and my branding friends yell at me for using table, and I say, but it's rows and columns of data, so I'm allowed to use a table, right? Yes. See? Well, SharePoint guys, we're smart. So I have a table, I have my heading, and then you can see here in my body, I have this, for each, right? So welcome to JavaScript. So my application here is just doing what looks like a HTML5 construct, and that's why there's the green squiggly line. And I'm going to then, for each article, I'm going to bind half a dozen columns. Now, I'm sure you all noticed, because you're as sharp as I am, that my screen from last year had a column, and from left to right it was title, summary, author, and created. And you can see in my markup that it doesn't have the author. So here's the first gotcha that I ran into. When you do a REST call to get your list item, you get the author ID, which is a number. In my case, it's number 1 because it's administrator. But that is a lookup to the user info list that exists in the site collection. And the user info list then has their login name and their display name and other cached information from Active Directory, right? We all remember this, yes? Okay, well, so I can do, in REST, I can do $select equals and ask for the author name, and I get nothing. And I can create a REST, instead of saying just items with $select equals, I can just do item, parentheses 0/author, and it gets me the name. So I can retrieve the name with a single REST call using directly to the property, which gets me none of the other data, or I can get all the data with no author. And after a while, I chose not to display the author. So, and I mentioned my scenario to everybody, all the guys in the speaker room, and they all pretty much had the same thing. Yeah, it's kind of a pain. So, long story short, learn JavaScript. In my case, it was a scoping issue because I ended up showing like multiple rows in my table with different author names, but it was all the same title. So obviously I was doing something wrong. So another thing I want to show you here, the last one here, another little tip. There is a library called moment.js that gives us toString. And I'm going to blame this on people on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, because by default it shows dates just great. And then I show up over here and it wasn't in the approved format of some sort, right? So moment.js is a JavaScript library to help you do date handling, because in JavaScript dates are a long string. And people format them different. So that's my HTML. And now we get into the stuff I'm sure you're all waiting for. What about the script? I get a lot of stuff here in my script. Let me zoom in on this. So, references.js comes with my new project. I like that. I'll show it to you in a minute. App.js came with, however, it was a little simple CSOM call to get my name and show it in a page, which is not very helpful, but that comes with. Elements.xml comes with, that's the typical deploying a module. jQuery came with. When you create a new SharePoint hosted application, Visual Studio is going to inject the jQuery library for you automatically. Kbase is mine, and then at the bottom are 2 libraries that I added. And I added them using Tools, Library Package Manager, which is the NuGet. And because someone told me that these things exist, I could do a search for Knockout and Moment. And when you search for them in this package and you click the Install button, what happens is this extension manager updates your Visual Studio project with these files for you automatically. Very nice. We like that. I'm pretty sure that was not written by the SharePoint Tools group at Microsoft, but it works very well. So that's my JavaScript. I'm not going to show you all of the other libraries because you can learn about those on your own. Let me real quick go into references. I think this may look familiar to a bunch of you. This gives us JavaScript IntelliSense. Rather than putting these lines in every script file everywhere, I can put them in one place. Andrew Connell has discovered that this works even though the reference path for Knockout and KBase doesn't have a path. So Visual Studio is going to assume it's in the scripts folder. If you do rocket scientist type JavaScript, which is an oxymoron if I ever heard one, but if you do that and you do things like, what did he call it? I'm drawing a blank down. He used a bunch of tools which required script files to be in a certain location for the view models and so on. The references didn't work. So be aware that sometimes you may have a difficulty with your IntelliSense by using the references.js. Okay, so, okay. Now we get into the programming part. We like that, right? And so I'm using Knockout and doing some read up on Knockout. Basically, we have model, view, view model. And so I need to have each of those things. The HTML I showed you is my view, right? The model is going to be my data, like we would do in the old days. So in the old days, I would do SP2013 to create a class, and then I would copy that and paste it in my project and tweak it as I needed to. So I needed to create a class, if you will, that shows my stuff, and so here it is. And this is simple JavaScript function starting at line 6 and going down just a little bit below here. And you can see here I'm basically defining 4 or 5 properties that have getters and setters. And then this down here, even though it doesn't look like it, is my constructor. So I borrowed this. See, I'm an experienced developer. I don't write code. I borrowed it. This technique I borrowed from Scott Hillier, who's done a couple blog posts on that. It's Scott with 1 T, Hillier with 2 L's.com. There's a little book out there about that thick. It's basically a 4-chapter 2013 dev book written for experienced 2010 devs. Highly recommend it. It was $10 on Amazon. I don't know how much it is out there, but it basically also covers JavaScript techniques like this. So this seemed to work for me. I'm not wild about the getters and setters and stuff like that, but there's other techniques, but this worked for me. But the core thing here I'm telling you is I now have a class that has the properties that I need for each row in my list. Just like I would do if I was doing SP2013. I could do a similar concept, right? You with me on that? Huh? Can't hear you. Yeah, all right, thank you. This is the last of it here. Basically, I'm returning something, which means that's like the public interface. So there you go. You can see what I have here. All right, that's my model. And now next I have a view model. And so the view model, before I get to that, that's down here. I'm going to open this one here before I do that. I defined a separate class, if you will, inside of JavaScript that basically does the REST call to get my data. And so that's what we're doing here. The var deferred equals on line 46, that's a JavaScript promise or jQuery promise. You're going to want to use your search engine to learn about promises. Ben Robb talked about them at length in his Windows 8 session, and I don't know that he made it any more clear for me because it's kind of a wacky concept, but and Andrew talked about his as well, and I'm sure others have. You'll see they're out here. But I think you might recognize the code starting at line 50. I'm creating an AJAX call, jQuery AJAX call, to my web server relative URL, and I'm saying give me the lists by title /items, and I'm selecting a couple columns and I'm ordering it in a certain order, right? I am a SharePoint hosted app, so _SP page context info is available to me because my app is running inside of SharePoint. If that shows as null to you, you probably are not running inside a SharePoint app. So that's just a little shortcut I can take because of there. And so, in the manual it says you have to say this. You have to do OData equals verbose, otherwise it doesn't work the way you'd expect. That's defined as my KB article query. So think of it as kind of like a method that I've just created to go get the query later. All right. App.js, let me turn it off real quick. Basically, app.js is saying, okay, I want you to initialize my view model and then do the data binding. So let me show you what the data model is. My data model is basically the glue between my class of KB articles and my HTML. My HTML is saying for each get articles. So I need to have a get articles something. I have something. It returns articles, which is a variable defined the line above, which is a ko.observable array. Ko is knockout. The idea here is that the knockout library that I'm loading, where I have the data binding in the HTML, it basically is watching the articles array. And if the articles array changes, it'll rebind the data for me. And in addition, if any of the items inside that array change, it would update automatically as well. I'm not doing any of that fancy updates. Andrew talked about it in more detail, but I need to have something that's a knockout observable in order for the binding to work. So those two lines are pretty straightforward. If you remember, I called my initialize method, and this is where we get into the promises, but I'm hoping you can at least work your way through it. In general, I am making my call. So execute, remember KB article.execute does the rest call. The promise.then says I wait until it finishes. And if it finishes, I either have a success or a failure, right? That's a typical JavaScript async model. When I get a success, I'm going to flush my array and then repopulate it, looping through the items that I get back. And so what I tried to do is right here, I tried to make a call to go get the author ID. And then when I was updating my article and something was out of whack and I finally gave up because I'm not a JavaScript developer yet. But I think this part kind of makes sense, right? We've written this type of code a lot. I go to some data source, I get the data, I create my class. What I'm doing here is I'm creating a new article, right? My constructor, passing in the values. Once I have the new item, I add it to my collection. Pretty straightforward stuff, right? Okay, maybe it's not straightforward, but do you understand?
Yeah.
So let's summarize this once again. App.js creates a new namespace. It defines an event to fire when the document is ready using the jQuery, right? So when the page is fully loaded, I will then initialize my view model, which will do the query, which will then wait for the query to finish to fill my observable array. In the meantime, it goes on to line 7. And in the meantime, what I mean by that is the promises that I mentioned basically says we can continue, this method will continue while the call happens behind the scenes. So I then apply bindings using knockout. And the isc.kb article view model is my quote view model, and results table is the HTML DOM ID that I'm using to populate my data. So that's my data binding. And then my program is done, and the knockout library sits and waits, and as soon as the articles collection changes, it repaints the screen. You with me? Yes. I'm losing you. We got 20 minutes. I'll see if I can bore you even more in 20 minutes. So I'm on Office 365 right now, hoping that and there it is, yes! Yeah, not too exciting, right? But at least the point here is that I have an app, right? So I have data. In the app web, I cheated to put it in there. I can then pull it out using REST and show it in here. So the moral of the story is if you're converting your solution to a SharePoint hosted app, you have to know more about JavaScript than you probably do now. Is that fair to say? All right. But REST and SharePoint hosted are not the only choices. So I'm going to switch to a different project, and lo and behold, that won't be the same. Let me go to recent. I decided to create an AutoHosted app. I don't know that I would do AutoHosted app in production because it's like a big black box of stuff that I have no insight into, but that you can choose to do whatever you wish. AutoHosted is the perfect demo model. So thank you, Microsoft. I will never do one in demo mode that's not, because there's so much work to do on provider hosted. In fact, I tried in my security talk and it crashed and burned. So this is my project here. Let me open this up real quick here. Solution Explorer, there'll be a lot of redundancy. So I get two projects in a cloud-hosted app. One is the app web, one is the remote web. Looking at the app web, you can see I have familiar looking things. Fields, I guess I had a little hiccup there about why would I call one site columns and one fields, but it's called fields, it's called content types, and list instances, and the app icon. That one I remembered, right? So, not much different there, right? Obviously it's got features and all kinds of good stuff, packages, all that stuff, SharePoint stuff that we know and love. I'm not gonna cover that again. I have a second project that is my web. And so my remote web, when you choose auto-hosted, or even if you choose provider-hosted, by default it is an ASP.NET 4 website. ASP.NET, server-side code, yes! I guess you guys aren't as excited about it as I am. So, I have the HTML, oh, it's up here, default is open here. Let me hide this. So in default.aspx, by the way, because it's an ASP.NET 4.0 project, I have a designer, for those of you who like the design view. And you can see here, it looks similar to what I did before. The HTML is, instead of a table, I actually can use my grid view. Right? So again, this is really your choice as to how you wish to do it. And as you can imagine, in this particular one, I have events that I'd expect to happen. And so let's real quick here go into Onload. And there's something a little different going on here, right? So I'm running in a remote web. I need to communicate back. You can use S2S, which I talked about yesterday morning. You can use OAuth, which Ted talked about yesterday afternoon. I'm using an auto-hosted app, and I'm going to be using OAuth here. And when the request happens in SharePoint, I click on my app start page, or the redirect link, and I get a token from SharePoint that says this is your ticket to get back in with security later. And now my app gets that, and that's the get context token from request. Now think back to what I said about our app here. We have a grid, and column 1 is a link that I can click on to go to a detail page. I didn't show this in my JavaScript app, but if you think about it, I'm on the default page, now I click and I go back to my detail page. That token from the request came from SharePoint to my home page. When I go from my home page to my detail page, I don't have that anymore. That context token is given to me when I leave SharePoint. I come in through the front door. So I'm cheating and just throwing it in a session state because I have to have it. So you need to find an appropriate place to store this token if you're going to be leaving your page. In Andrew's talk yesterday, where he did a lot of work in a single page application, he never left his page, not a problem, right? Token's good for 30 minutes. So if your users will be inside your page for 31 minutes, it'll time out. So you need to understand how to refresh that token, and there's a way to do that. So that's what I'm doing in Onload. I just cheated here in Nonrender. I'm creating a data table in memory, and then after I create the data table in memory, build up the query using our favorite query language, Camel. And then using client-side object model, the .NET managed client object model, Microsoft.SharePoint.client.dll. The security bits are happening for us in the .NET side here because they give us a class called Token Helper, or they give us the source code to a class called Token Helper. And I can say, hey, I have an access token that SharePoint gave me. I'm going to convert that to an OAuth security token. And in addition, it will create the client context for me. So when I have my client context, I can just write client-side object model code in SharePoint that we all know and love, or at least we all know. And then so you can see here, I'm loading, right? So I define my web. I get the list. This is the list I want. Load the items here. I'm executing my query, right? when that comes back, so in the .NET world, this will block until it comes back, so I don't have promises and I don't have success or event handlers. I can just do a try catch and let this run. When it comes back, I loop through the results, I populate my in-memory data table, and when I'm all done with that, I data bind, and life is good. And this particular one, I added code in here to build the URL, so if I go to this one, that would be here. And that would not be here. That would be this one. Let's go back up to my site. I'm not deploying because I don't want to tempt fate. It worked in the speaker room, so that's what you're going to see now. In this particular case, I'm clicking on it. The app is redirecting to my remote web URL. Why on earth should I be the first guy to have a successful demo in this room, right? So I pressed F5, and I'm going to let this run. And hopefully, you know what the error was? Because I didn't actually deploy it to the store, so I was trying to do the Visual Studio web server. SharePoint's redirecting me back to my local debugging, and it wasn't running. So we'll let this run while I rest. Any questions at this point? Yes, sir?
What version of Visual Studio are you running?
The question is, what version of Visual Studio am I running? Answer is 2012. I happen to be using the ultimate.
Update 1 or update 2?
I'm using update 1. I've heard stories that update 2 might break some things, but I don't have any experience with that. I have done update 2 on non-SharePoint stuff, and it's fine. Working on it. I want to take a poll. How many think working on it will be more frustrating than unexplained error has occurred? Yeah, okay. Hey, it worked. Woo! So, a couple things to point out. The blue bar at the top, of course, is the Chrome control. Using that because I need to provide that link back, and so you can learn more about that by using the Chrome control. There's 2 ways to do it. One's declarative, one's JavaScript. Everything below that is my page. And so you can see here, I don't have the SharePoint logo. I have the conference logo up there. And you can see now this particular one, I can actually click on a link. And I should get the detail. There it is, good deal, right? And obviously there's some padding issues and stuff. Next year is best practices, so we'll show you the best way to do this. But for now, at least we see the data that's here. Okay. All in all, not bad. I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, so just to wrap up, see, if it doesn't work, I can show you what it should look like. So there is my solution that I uploaded. And there is my SharePoint hosted app, and there is my cloud hosted app. And if I do this real fast, you think they're all the same, right? Oh yeah, they look great, perfect, good job. So let's recap about what we did here, right? So last year we had both of these. We had a sandbox solution, we had a farm solution. That's still supported, but deprecated. And again, deprecated means they are no longer investing in this technology, and if it doesn't work, they're going to say, gee, that's too bad. So test it, and if it works, you're good to go. Farm solution is fully supported on premises. You cannot do a farm solution to the cloud, right? So I would suspect that many of the early adopters of 2013 who have developers on staff are probably going on premise. But so farm solutions will work. I haven't noticed any issues yet. It's not to say that you won't find something that they broke, but in typical, I think we're okay. So now let's talk about all those items that we showed up before, right? So web parts, you need to do something with web parts if you're going to be using a SharePoint app. You can rewrite it as JavaScript, or you can move it to a cloud-hosted web or part of the app part, which is really kind of the same thing with some differences. List forms, they're there. I forgot to show you. If you type in the URL in your app web to the list name / disp form, whatever, it's still there. But you won't get any of the SharePoint Chrome. Remember, that blue bar across the top, I put that there using the Chrome control. Well, these list forms expect to run inside a host web, so it's really kind of a suboptimal user experience, if you will. So you really have to do something about that. BCS is extended. You can use Client-Side Object Model or REST through an external list. So if you created a BCS data model and you wrote code against the BCS API, you need to do that in Farm Solutions. If you have exposed your data model through an external list, you can use the REST or CSOM API to read the external list just as if it was a regular list. So that may or may not help you. Search is provided in the REST, and it may be in CSOM too. I forgot to look. And the OpenXML stuff here, I asked. They said you probably need to write that code in Azure and use remote event receivers. So that makes sense to you if you were here last year and you know what they were doing to be notified. So that's the choice that you want to do there. All right? And that's all I have. So any questions? All right? If you prefer to do the questions quietly, I have contact cards you're welcome to come up and get. At 4:15 or so, which is a little bit from now, we'll be next door doing the Ask the Experts. Hope you had a great time. Thanks for coming, and I hope to see you next year.